Welcome to Virtual Sentiments. I'm your host, Kristen Collins. On today's episode, I talked to Katharine Jarmul. She is a data scientist who focuses on privacy and security in data science, deep learning, and AI. She's the author of the well-received O'Reilly book, Practical Data Privacy, and has more than 10 years' experience in machine learning and AI, where she has helped build large-scale AI systems with privacy and security built in. She also has a newsletter and YouTube channel on these topics, both called Probably Private, which you can check out at our show notes. Katharine and I recorded our conversation on June 24th, 2026. And right now, I am recording this introduction and our recap at the end of the episode on July 20th, 2026. This means that Katharine and I were not able to talk about last week's big news in AI, which was the release of Kimi K3, a major model by China's Moonshot AI. Moonshot AI has promised to release these weights that the model relies on, making it a major open weight model. This has led to a lot of different debates, and I won't be commenting on that in this episode, and Katharine and I couldn't talk about it. But you will still be interested in this episode because Katharine explains some of the important technical topics in machine learning and AI, which are crucial to these debates in the first place. She talks about how there are major differences between proprietary models, closed-weight models, and open-weight models. While there aren't really any fully open-source models, she talks about how open-weight models, transparency measures, and open science practices more broadly actually have a number of advantages when it comes to the privacy and security concerns that her work focuses on. We also talk about how individuals and groups of friends, coworkers, anyone you're in community with can play with, hack, and experiment with models in order to better understand how they work for themselves, to demystify and cut through some of the hype and the weaker critiques. As AI becomes ever more part of our political debates in the US and around the world, from things like privacy and security to data sovereignty, whether you're excited about this new technology or absolutely hate it, I do think that better understanding how these products work firsthand, including in the kind of communal practices that Katharine helps facilitate by learning with each other, learning from each other's perspectives, is going to be crucial. I'm so grateful to Katharine for joining me for this conversation, and I'm so excited to share this episode with you all. On today's episode of Virtual Sentiments, I am talking to Katharine Jarmul. She is a data scientist who focuses her work and research on privacy and security in data science, deep learning, and AI. She's the author of the well-received O'Reilly book, Practical Data Privacy, and has more than 10 years' experience in machine learning and AI, where she has helped build large-scale AI systems with privacy and security built in. Thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you again for the invite. I'm excited to be here.
I'm so thrilled. You are such an excellent communicator of very technical and difficult topics. And I think now more than ever, we really need people who are able to make a lot of discussions in AI more accessible, not just for policy audiences, but for the broader public. And so the way I wanted to kind of frame this conversation is that past year we have seen huge debates and political discussions around AI. And some of the most popular concerns or why it's become so much of a salient policy issue is around national security. So we had Anthropic's Mythos and just recently Fable have been kind of used to say, listen, this technology is so dangerous. We need to make it kind of more limited in terms of who can access it, because of the possibilities for finding vulnerabilities in cybersecurity, and that these powerful models are even almost like nuclear weapons. So we should have them be kind of controlled by centralized authority. And the kind of closed and proprietary models are kind of essential for things like security and privacy and things like that. But I feel like, you could see easily how that might be in some companies' interest to make those arguments or in the government's interest to make those arguments. And so I wanted to talk to you about, what does it mean to talk about open source instead? Why are open source models valuable? What are their strengths? Is it maybe the case that open source actually can be advantageous for people who are concerned with privacy and things like that? So, the kind of way I wanted to start us off with just the basics. Like, what's the difference between a proprietary and closed source model versus open source models, or closed weight versus open weight models?
Yeah, so it's a great question and a good debate. When we think about what do we mean when we say open source models, that's a little bit different than open weight models. So let's disambiguate the two a bit. Like open source models in theory would mean that not only was the training data openly released, so how was the model trained, perhaps also the validation and evaluation or testing data sets are released and explicitly named. That means you could reproduce for yourself the exact results, which would be in line with a lot of what we think about when we think about open science. And in addition to that, perhaps the code that went into actually programming the architecture of the model. So, most models have some sort of architecture. A lot of what we use today is an architecture that we call the transformer with different things changed, but basically that somebody would release the entire model, the code for the pre-processing, the code for the training, the model itself, the testing, all of these things, so that every single person that had access to enough compute, which is another question, could potentially reproduce the model and or deviate from the model, essentially similar to how we do open source code. They could change something and they could release that. And if we wanted to do so really at scale, we could also look at things like open source licensing. We have many, many decades of that experience in software and in lots of technology, also in data technology. And that would be fully open source. But I would say in that ilk, there's almost no open source models. There's varying degrees between kind of maybe that ideal and the closed, completely proprietary, completely unknown types of models that a lot of the larger AI vendors are releasing today. And along that way, of course, is the open weight models that we have, which is essentially where we release the weights of the model, which means anybody can actually run the model on their own hardware for inference, which basically means for prediction. Sorry, lots of machine learning words. And that at least offers a little bit of transparency. Perhaps maybe the best in between point that we see today of what people actually do is an open weight and then some information about the training data, the evaluation, and the validation of the model. Because when we have that, at least we can make a guess of what biases might exist in the model, what problems might exist in the model. And I like to point to Apertus, which was a model released by the Swiss government and EPFL, where they actually also released some details about privacy and security testing. And I would like for that to become the norm, myself and numerous other people. So, but that's obviously very, very far from where we are currently with today's largest models and their release. Yeah.
Yeah, great. So we'll talk more about both of those kind of different approaches, or the kind of the Swiss model you discussed and then the proprietary models. But yeah, so then let's start with that. Like the big models that people are familiar with, like, Anthropic, OpenAI, Google's DeepMind. How are these, what does it mean for these to be proprietary or closed? Like, what is this side of the spectrum? What does that look like? What are its kind of strengths and weaknesses if you're concerned about things, not just like the effectiveness of the model, but the technical specs, but also kind of privacy and security concerns?
I mean, I don't see how lack of transparency would ever add to privacy. I mean, one could argue obscurity, but that's been proven wrong many times. So I don't see that making any sense to me personally. I'm sure there's somebody else that disagrees with that. They might have a legal background and not a scientific one, but
Yeah, so well, that's a great point. But let me ask more then. Like, why, from a technical perspective, is it that isn't that a lack of transparency doesn't kind of protect the maybe data or the processes from privacy threats?
well, from a certain point of view, privacy from a technical perspective is about information to some degree, right? And so when we think about how we learn differently depending on how much information, and we learn differently depending on how unique a piece of information is and how useful a piece of information is from just a learning theory perspective, not how humans learn. This is how computers learn. And so when we think about what we know of information theory, coding theory, learning theory, none of which are new at all. These are theories that, yeah, we have learned things about, but we have known for quite some time. And when you look about the mathematical proofs that we look at for how can we enforce something to be what we call privately learned, and that means if I learn from you, I can't actually trace that back to you in some which way. I can learn maybe things about you that are similar to other persons, but I should not be able to learn something specific about you individually that I could then pull essentially out of that algorithm again. And when we look at that theory, we should be able to technically prove this, especially if we have done so in such a way that it can be validated by others, or we should be able to transparently talk about this. And we can see this with the Gemini Vault Gemma model. So Google actually did release a differentially private trained model. We can argue a we can argue a lot of things also scientifically about whether we can say that text can ever be differentially private. That is another debate to be had. But I think the debate between maybe some of the legal understandings of how we can guarantee privacy and some of the technical understandings of how we can guarantee privacy start to often pull against each other in different ways, where maybe reaching the legal bar of saying, well, we informed people and maybe it's better that we don't release their data. Yes. But does that scientifically mean that we haven't memorized their data, that we haven't put them at undue privacy risk, that motivated attacker couldn't potentially extract information from a model about them? That's a different type of evaluation criteria.
No, that's really helpful. I mean, that's exactly the kind of thing that, like, if you don't have any technical knowledge, you're not going to understand the difference between those things, and the kind of the way that like policy might not get at that. And let's call that also like a security risk type of thing.
Yeah, and again, I think like maybe where they support each other is more of, consent, informed consent, and understanding of how data might be used, right? So because I'm not obviously not against machine learning on data, that's what I've
Yeah,
done
of
for most
course.
of my career.
Yeah, of course.
But it is about like what do we actually mean when we think about what guarantees we can give people when we learn on their data, and why I myself and numerous other privacy engineers thinks it's very important for transparency to be play a large role also in how do we test and evaluate models before release.
Well, and that transparency is so that is a part of like when we talk about like to be, because I'm not a lawyer, I'm a political theorist, but so when we talk about like consent, I think is valuable because it's a way of articulating and enabling autonomy. It's a way of like enabling people to be able to be active participants and understand what exactly they're doing in a particular relationship, and in this case with what kind of data that company is collecting about them and how it might be used. It is so therefore something that like having more information, you can't just because you consent to something, but if you don't actually know what's going on under the hood, what kind of autonomy do you actually have? Like what kind of power do you actually have to understand what's going on and the kind of potential trade-offs you're making by choosing kind of one company over the other? So I think that makes sense. So then let's get into that a little bit more too. So the proprietary protections that the models have. I mean, my understanding, part of that is because, there's trade secrets. People want to kind of protect their technologies and things like that. So we can't really know what some of these companies do entirely if they don't choose to provide that information in terms of how they train models or the particular architecture or the weights. And so I wanted to kind of know more about, like, from your understanding, since you have so much experience in machine learning, you value it. What are some of the kind of decisions that companies might make behind the scenes and behind the kind of on the back end of model development that kind of shape the user experience that we maybe don't always understand is partly kind of the decisions and choices that they are making themselves when they decide to put something out there?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, most of the choices that I think people would consider proprietary are data related at this point in time. There are occasionally new, what we would call machine learning architectures, but those are less frequent and or involve small changes. And usually actually those are reported in model release. So usually the companies want to brag like, we made it more efficient by doing this thing. So we're really smart. Come work for us, these types of things, which is fine.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
think if anybody wants to learn more, I highly recommend looking at Sebastian Rashka's work, who wrote also a great book called Build Your Own LLM from Scratch. So there's lots of people that are kind of studying these small changes in architecture, and I think they're pretty well known, and I wouldn't call them trade secrets. Of course, I'm sure some people might want to, but that's not where I would consider that being that exciting. Probably most of it is either in the data collection. So, what data do they use? Many of today's AI vendors use a series of subcontractors that get a lot of data from, at this point in time, kind of skilled people like ourselves and like potentially many listeners of this show. There was a great story, I'll try to look it up, about PhDs being unable to find jobs, so they go into writing for AI companies, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there's a whole business model around producing data that sounds smart, that is not scraped from the internet, mainly due to copyright issues, and
Yeah.
to use it, to invest quite a bit of money in this type of data collection, you can think of it as. And in addition to that, then there's people, I think OpenAI was the first one to have it, but by now many companies have followed suit. There's a role at OpenAI that they invented called the model designer. And the idea of the model designer is to kind of work like a product designer, but directly with the machine learning engineers, decide what is the feeling of the model, what is the design and experience of the model. And that means that when we do the steps of alignment training near the end, but also when we do any fine tuning based on personal preferences, we say those people are helping decide what data are we using, who's in charge of labeling that data so that it says this response is, rated a 10 and this one's rated a 6 and this one's rated a 4. And so they kind of build these things that often users experience as personalities or ways of talking. They build them, they train them into the model itself. And there's quite a lot of money and time being spent on that, and potentially new ways of delivering that based on region, based on language, based on perhaps personalization, where you can take essentially a small set of weights and deliver them personalized or more personalized to a user based off of any of those criteria. You can think of these as like almost applying a recommendation algorithm type of experience to a machine learning model interface.
Interesting. So can you just kind of make that concrete for me? Like, so what does that mean? Like, also like changing the way, like giving a different, slightly different like personality to the model? Or is it like in terms of like what it's going to feel like as a user? Like, so let's say, so what people are familiar with is that like generally the chatbots are like very sycophantic. So then is that something that by changing a small set of weights like that and delivering those, you could either like make it less sycophantic or more sycophantic, or is it something else that's it's changing typically?
Well, we have two major knobs. There's more than just two knobs, but let's just talk about two major knobs. One is, the prompt, what we call the system prompt. So where they say like, this AI model does these things, blah, 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 right? And those are very easy to change, right? And it would be silly to assume that they aren't being changed and updated on a regular basis to some degree, especially across languages, regions, and so on and so forth. And then within that is kind of your conversation history, your profile, other things about you, which are now most certainly appended to the prompt. So there's those things, right? And those all affect a part of the model that we call the attention mechanism. That's basically going to influence the types of topics, language, and other things like this used, because it makes the words that are held within that attention more important and available, and words like them, than other words. Just to oversimplify. That's a massive
Yeah,
oversimplification.
yeah.
I'm sorry, machine learning engineers listening to this. Um, but I feel like I just want to give you an idea of that, right? And then there's the actual, what I was talking about just before this, was an actual way that we can essentially think of it. We have the huge model, right? And then I just want to patch it. I just want to take some of those little light up bulbs out. And you think of it like a light bright, because we talk about activations, right? A light bright, I guess, is not for all age groups, but for our
We can put a
age
link
group,
in the show notes of like, this is what a historical artifact of a light bright. Has it been in any Toy Story movies? Because maybe if they've had a light
yeah,
bright in Toy
maybe.
Story movies.
For those of us that know, we know. Um, and then you just gonna patch some different colors on there, right? To change the experience. And that we can actually do now, extremely optimized, and what we call basically in flight. So as the data is happening, with special techniques for basically trying to choose these weights are most important based on this fine tuning that we've done, this actual training that we've done. We're just going to swap them out. And it's kind of open secret that that's being experimented with to also change the experience based on, again, things like region, language, maybe other types of preferences, right?
No, and I think that so one reason why I think that talking about that is really helpful is because, often there is this very simplistic way of talking about technologies that they are just kind of neutral tools. And especially, this is like something I remember this was also happening when and obviously we still talk about social media and all that and how it impacts, our lives and politics. But especially both social media and the AI models, sometimes people will say like, well, they're just kind of mirrors. Like they just are kind of like, if somebody does something bad with them, it's because the person, it's like we are bad. Like we, not always, but human beings are flawed creatures who will do bad and immoral things, and will use tools to do that. And so there's nothing about, the tool. But I mean, there are other ways in which like there are decisions that shape the kind of choices and ways that you behave in interfacing with a given technology, right? And so, for example, why chatbots might be sycophantic, it might be like because people will be more engaged with them. People say they don't like it, but the revealed preferences of when people are actually using them, they will be more active. They will keep using one the more sycophantic and the model is, even if that leads it to like, in false or delusional type of kind of outputs and interactions, right? And so, you know, I guess if there are some ways that like you having this technical knowledge could help people better understand why they shouldn't think of a model as just a mirror, or even just as like, even I think sometimes the tendency for us to anthropomorphize the models is also kind of dangerous because, it's giving an agency to the model that also makes it seem more kind of like a natural kind of independent, you know, platform of its own or being of its own, when in reality there's so many of these, technical choices on the back end that might be, that people are making decisions about that are shaping how those interactions go about. They're not like, just organic to the model learning in some, way, which of course, learning can happen, but whatever. See, this is where we get into like, I need you to be talking about this because I
No,
don't
no,
have the
no.
technical knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, to bring back up model designer, like people are designing models like they're designing products, and to not take into account that engagement and data acquisition, right? So the more engaged you have people, the more data you get. Even if people don't check a box, use my data for training, you're still getting information. Most of the terms and conditions, by the way, say that if you give a response a thumbs up, thumbs down, that data can be saved regardless of your user settings, right? So just FYI, people, like ideas of your data are being used,
Yeah, it's like
right?
kind of a meta information about your interactions, even if the exact like text that you're putting in isn't used.
Yeah, there's lots of clever legal ways to get ideas of data without storing the exact data. But what I want people to think about, or like why I like leading groups to try to, hack LLMs or experiment with LLMs or even other types of models, diffusion models, which are the models that produce images or take images and produce images. And why I recommend people play also with local LLMs is to demystify some of the things that are made to feel like magic, and they're made to feel like magic on purpose. And it could be fun to play with magic. I mean, I have nothing against magicians. I don't, I like to be amused too, right? And we all like to be entertained to some degree. But to separate maybe some of the things that are pure marketing from what is actually the technology that we're using, I recommend people use more than one AI vendor. So even just to switch it up and see, and B, to start to tinker. You don't have to be an engineer to tinker. You can tinker many ways. And if you start tinkering, you're probably going to start noticing some different tells of different types of model design, of different levels of information about different topics, which is also totally interesting and fine, and a cool way to learn which models you like using for what. But it helps you, I think, avoid the idea of, becoming essentially a fan person of just one AI, and also avoiding thinking, it's going to magically save all of the problems in the entire world. Or have like a psychotic break, which of course numerous people have had by this point in time. But, it helps to make it less, maybe perhaps to some degree, a little bit less interesting, more utilitarian.
Yeah, yeah, no, and I think that's important. I mean, I think we're not going to get into all of this, but I think the thing that's in the background here is again the kind of political context that we're in, right? And so people, we're now at a moment where there have been much more activation of the public around issues around AI, people protesting data centers and build out. And I think a part of that, whatever I think there's definitely people who see that as uninformed or naive or something. But I think what is happening with that, is that people are reckoning with the fact that companies are able to have all these meetings with people in power, and they're seeing these debates, and obviously, and also at the same time the government kind of wielding power against companies too. So I'm not saying it's totally friendly. Whereas like ordinary people are hearing all this marketing, like you're going to lose your jobs, or they're being kind of forced to figure out how to use AI in their jobs, maybe not finding it to be super useful, or just kind of confused about like, what am I supposed to do with this thing? Or or the problems that companies with like token maxing, where like straight up like now your rewards are for using as much AI as possible, regardless of whether it's actually like getting the work done. You're kind of creating work or creating reorienting people's priorities. So that is to say, it's become a political issue. It's like in people's lives. And so I feel like you can't blame them for trying to figure out a way to express whatever discontent or frustration they have if they don't have a lot of opportunities for that. So I guess that puts that, I'm just putting that on the page of like the context that we're in terms of thinking about why we would want to make these models less magical, less interesting, is both, I think even people who are enthusiastic about them might see the value of that because you maybe make people less afraid of them. But also you have to be willing to allow this conversation to be broader, right? You have to be willing to allow people, ordinary people who maybe aren't the technical experts to be, a part of this conversation. But the way that the proprietary models are structured and private companies being in control does make it really hard, I think, to have these types of conversations in an informed way.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I agree with many. First, let me just state I agree with many of the things that you said, particularly. I find it quite interesting to watch that people get fired for using too much AI, then people also get fired because of AI, then other people get fired because they're using too little AI. The only theme I see there is something about people getting fired and AI. There's
Yeah.
no evidently there's no right way to do it. So
Yeah.
of course, then people are afraid, obviously, and for a good reason, right? Because if it's something AI means that you can fire 30% of your workforce, then that's of course terrifying and very real. It's not imaginary like the idea of, whatever next model being, I don't know, sentient or whatever, right? That's very unreal. It's very unserious from a scientific point of view. And yet, the both of these myths, the mythology around whatever's happening around this is, being used for other, means, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think people have a right to be angry and upset and afraid, and any other feelings they're feeling about it, I think are extremely valid. And I think what's happening is because there's all those feelings, you can't even really have real conversations about it at work. I follow I don't know if you know the newsletter, I think the Liz and Molly, and they recently
Oh, yes. Yeah.
did a survey about, feelings around AI. And they found that like even people that were finding it useful at work said they were afraid to talk with their peers about it because it was such a sensitive topic they couldn't even talk about it in any reasonable way. And I think it's not a neutral tool by any means, and it's not an apolitical tool. But at the end of the day, if machine learning is going to do anything for us, then it is to some degree some sort of tool. And even though it's political, not neutral, and of course now heavily marketed, figuring out what even is this tool and can we even use it for anything useful means, having, validating those feelings in the room and figuring out ways to work around them, talk about them, you know, and perhaps maybe even play with them. So one of the things I often recommend when I do AI security trainings and stuff like this, is, to pair program with the code assistant. So you're two or three persons all looking at the same screen, all using the code assistant together. And what you find in those dynamics is it starts to pull away the magic, because if you have three persons, they're going to have three different points of view. They're going to be talking about it. They're going to be interacting differently. And you're going to rebuild this human connection and human conversation, which is what most of our knowledge in the world is built on.
Yeah. Yeah,
and
exactly.
and kind of start demystifying, debunking, and maybe find some cool uses of some things that do not involve people losing their jobs.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's great. Yeah. And so, one way to kind of get into that more optimistic view is then it seems like, I mean, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Is that something, that kind of learning process and that kind of like tinkering? I'm sure you can't, like you said, it's worth doing with all the different models and comparing them and just sort of seeing the different interactions that even if you're not, even if you're just a user who doesn't have the expertise, like being able to see those differences might help you understand better what's going on. But is that one of the also values of working with open source, more open source or open weight models, in terms of kind of enabling people to kind of tinker around and like and see what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I like people to tinker with open weight is because they could run it, there are numerous tools, Olama being one of them, but there's also other ones that you can use. Mozilla AI has one called Llama File that will work even on old computers. And in doing so, you can run it even on limited hardware. And usually these models are also very limited in functionality in comparison. And I think that helps. Some people are like, well, it's that you can't even compare it to AI vendor name here. Yeah. I mean, if you're expecting it to do 700 things at once, that's probably, by the way, more than one model. Sure. But if you're saying, I want to understand how the wheels on this bicycle work, and then compare it with wheels on an airplane, at the end of the day, yes, they are both wheels, right? And so to some degree, I think I want people to see smaller models. Also, it's maybe better for the world that we use smaller models eventually, or more task specific models, as we've been talking about in machine learning for a long time. And, find some funny things, right? Find some stuff that you like that they do, some stuff that you don't like, and then compare that with, whatever. I hope your boss isn't forcing you to use AI, but if they are, then you compare it to whatever you're being forced to use. And if why I like playing in a security mindset, and I started an event here that I would love to tell people about called the Feminist AI LAN Party, where you run local models and you tinker and you play and you hack them, so to speak, is that honestly, some of the attacks you'll end up using on a small model will also work on big models. So there are some things that repeat themselves in large and small models.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, okay. So there's a lot we can dive in there, and I did want to make sure we talk about those feminist land parties you do, which is so awesome. And I think also, so that's a theme to hit on and emphasize, is the idea of like, I think that right now people, and partly I think this is an impact from the pandemic, like, but also just having this radical change and also a lot of other uncertainty in the world right now that's maybe somewhat related, but is different and distinct from just the technological change, is, people feel very alone and isolated and atomized, and that creates the fear and the distrust and the worry. And then, building out kind of more communal connections with each other, and then using that to like understand and again, kind of more actively engage with the technology as opposed to just kind of passively, doing the input outputs with the chatbots. So, but then I did want to go back to, I love the task specific point, because that's the thing that I understand. It's been kind of hard. I'm not, like I said, I'm not a technical expert, but I talked to, our mutual connection, John Koffold, some years ago about, when, shortly after Chat GPT kind of blew up and people were already kind of, I was adjuncting and having to deal with students using it and things like that. How do you navigate that? But I remember, it's the technology of the Chat GPT and other GPT, chatbot have really incredibly advanced over the past few years. But I do remember, and my understanding is that there's a good reason, even though there is this general purpose aspect to these things, a lot of times you might want more specific use cases, or is that the same thing as what you were referring to in terms of like task specific models, and what does that look like? Why are those beneficial? And like, why, yes, there's this general purpose technology element, but is that really the thing that, are we kind of making too much of that, and should we be thinking more about task specific models?
Well, it's the difference between saying, like, I would like access to the internet and saying, I want to store the entire internet on my computer, right? So both can give you access, one via, numerous other mechanisms. The other, we could just shove the entire internet into your computer. And I think one of the quote unquote advancements that we have is just increasing model size. And I put quote unquote around this because there's also things that happen with regard to privacy that are very bad for creators and copyright holders and writers and many other professions when we decide that we want one model to try to do everything. Because again, coming back to privacy and information, we're essentially trying to shove as much information as we can. And most of today's models are actually what we call over parameterized.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
What does it mean? It means they actually have more space than the amount of data that they're trained on, which basically would make Claude Shannon, the inventor of information theory, roll around in his grave, right? Because he was about how do we condense information? How do we make it efficient? Essentially, the models that we're building are extremely inefficient storage to some degree. They're also very useful, right? Because there's a totally different way of interacting with information. And I think that's, that was the quote unquote surprise to some degree of the chat based interface being so popular because I think myself and numerous other people in machine learning were like, but who would want to just talk with a machine learning algorithm? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
But we were wrong, right? And now I also chat with machine learning models. So it was, a product choice that was maybe not very well seen by numerous people in machine learning. But what we really usually were focused on in machine learning is we want the best model at doing this really specific thing. I want the best model ever at taking this language and translating it to this other language. So just for translation, I want the best model of making a photo and turning it into text. I want the best model for looking at a plant and telling me what species it is and where it's from and these types of things, right? So there's so many different types of models we can build. And I think one of the arguments in the space right now that really resonates with me outside of the privacy aspects of having smaller models, because when we don't try to shove an entire world of information into a model, we also expose less people to privacy failures and privacy violations and harms. But also, we have much smaller models for ecological purposes. And these are models that could run on your phone without using your whole battery. These are models that can run on low power stations. These are models that are just supposed to do one thing really well. And we've known how to do that for quite some time, and we could still do it now for a lot of things, even that people are using general purpose models for. But it's very out of trend right now amongst the research labs, sadly.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, I know that people love talking to the chat, but I don't, like I said, enjoy it. Yeah. So I'm not like no judgment. I tried because I do the podcast, I think about tech, and so I do try. I kind of have to force myself though to use the chatbots. I don't. And sometimes when I do use them, I'm basically using them like Google search, which I know is not what you're supposed to do. But it's like I want the actual information. Like I want like the actual knowledge, not the like I don't know whatever the summary is or something like that. So that's my difficulty.
Yeah, and now we killed search. Internet search
Yeah.
doesn't work anymore. So now you're kind of forced to use them because
Yeah.
a lot of internet search is extremely broken right now due to LLMs.
Yeah, well, and I have to admit, I mean, I was so I'm very lucky that I have, an institutional affiliation. So like I love using the university library search and then I can get straight to the pure stuff. Okay, so I wanted to, so let's go talk a little bit more about that privacy because you are such an excellent privacy expert. And I know data privacy and differential privacy is distinct and different, but I think it's therefore, and so I will kind of always be, talking a little incorrectly, I think. So feel free to correct me. But I think one of the other kind of areas of debates and discussions is things like data sovereignty and data privacy. So I wondered if you could kind of give us a little bit of a primer in terms of just understanding what those concepts mean in this context. And then I think, thinking about, how does that relate to what we've been just discussing in terms of, choices of models that stakeholders might use. Why would you choose one model over another? I think there is this easy way of like, it's really difficult, I think, as a non-expert, because you have to navigate the fact that like some of the most vocal kind of popular voices are people who are at some of these companies. And so there is this easy, like, well, proprietary models. It's something about these types of models are not just like useful efficiently, but because there's somehow going to be more secure or going to be, if we're talking about national sovereignty, they're going to be somehow more conducive to national sovereignty. So maybe you could help us kind of get some clarity on the concepts and why we want to keep these separate. We don't want to assume that one type of model is better for one type of concern.
Yeah, I mean, I think model choice is certainly both a technical, probably a social, and also a very political and economical, because they're inherently related choice. And I'm not here to tell people what models to use or not use, but I do think that we can think about sovereignty at a lot of levels. So, like, actually, because I work in privacy, I like to start at the individual level of sovereignty. So, where does your data go? Like, do you have access to your data? Can you control it? Can you control what models you choose? Can you control, like you said, when you don't want a model to be used? Like, can I say, actually, I'd rather not? I'd rather talk to a real human. These are all, this is the sovereignty that I can choose over my own life to some degree, right? And when I was looking into, I gave a talk on sovereign AI last year at FOSDEM, which is a large open source conference that happens in Brussels every year. And when I was looking into it, the German root of the word sovereign, so the word sovereign comes from French, but the German root kind of forked at an early stage, and it also meant mastery of a thing, so that you are both sovereign, free to choose, and also the master of a thing. And I like to think of this too when we think about the individual choice, and maybe also the next step up from an individual is maybe like a collective group. And that could be people at work. It could be, people in a union together. It could be, a family, right? It can be any numbers of things, but we also can have some collectivization of individuals who decide as a sovereign group, whether it's a nation state or not, right? As a sovereign group of humans, we want to choose our data. We want to choose our models. We want to choose how we evaluate models, right? How we choose which models represent us best, right? So you can even think of this, because some of the models are very bad at some sparse languages. You can think of this as the right to speak your language and have a justified experience in using an LLM, right? An equal or equivalent experience, which there's numerous projects for a variety of different types of sparse language and numerous projects. I know of two in India and one in different parts that collecting, I think, some parts of sub-Saharan Africa and so forth, where people are building local language models because the normal models are so poor at their language, right? So that is another element of sovereignty and choice and mastery, so to speak. And then at some level, we get to the nation state level, right? Which, of course, is intertwined with a bunch of other things, right? You know better than
Yes.
me. But at that level, at a nation state level or as a collection of member states like the EU level, you have to decide then what happens if another nation state doesn't operate under what we consider like the rules of the game at this stage, right? And at that point in time, you have to think, Well, if we have businesses that we have to support, if we, of course, military and national security level things, all of these sorts of things mean that if the data does not reside within a controllable region of that country or sovereign authority, then, you know, you might as well just say it's not sovereign, right? It's not actually, you don't have any real authority over that unless you're going to try to take it to international court, which has, a long waiting line and lots of other things involved, right? So I think when people are talking now today about AI sovereignty or data sovereignty, they often are talking about locality. Where are things located? And they're also talking about under what authority are the companies and or other players in the space. And yeah, that's obviously also becoming quite, I guess I could say, like spicy right now for
Yes.
a variety of reasons.
So then there's both like the data, is the data the kind of real, like the where the data is stored, how it's stored, and it's the protections of it. Is that kind of the most important aspect of the kind of the question of the sovereignty, or are there other kind of concerns that policymakers might have in terms of, the maybe the companies that are contracted with or things like that?
I mean, I think it's both, right? Because it's really about adherence to the rule of law, so to speak. So if a nation state can say you operate within my borders, all of the data and all of the models that you serve for my residents are within my borders, that's a much different guarantee than maybe some of the data is here, maybe some of the data is there, maybe you can reach the service if we decide that we don't connect via internet, maybe not, right? So these are the types of choices that these people are trying to make at this point in time. And obviously, it's very different between thinking of that on a national security level and thinking of that as a, what do we make available or what do we recommend for much smaller things. But I think there's a reason why, at least here in Germany, there's been a shift towards using perhaps EU built systems and or open source software. And there's a continued debate towards those types of discussions because of the questions of what could happen and obviously continuous risk and threat analysis of what is important for people to prioritize.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so then again, as like a non-technical expert, why is open source compatible with security, or open source software compatible with people who have security concerns? Like, why is that not more dangerous from a security perspective?
Yeah, I mean, that has been a debate that has happened now for decades in the field of cryptography, is what I usually like to refer people to. And even though there were bugs in cryptographic code that people used for many years, I was talking specifically about OpenSSL and Heartbleed, which was a particular attack on encrypted web traffic that was uncovered. The idea is that if things are open, they can be reviewed by many persons. And when things are closed, they can only be reviewed or audited by people either who are paid by the group that owns that software and or those systems, right? Or by the group itself. And so when we think of like, do we want to certify security? Do we want to do that open, closed? And usually the answer from at least the cryptography community has been we want to try to do that open. Maybe there are some things that are proprietary and closed, but they are not the core algorithms and the core theorems that underpin the security guarantees of cryptography. Because again, in the nature of science and in the history of science through thousands of years now, we have always made things better and more secure by making them open and then asking people to break them to figure out how they don't work and then continuing again. I do want to put a little asterisk that I think one of the things, if I'm trying to think, I'm trying to offer goodwill to some of the AI vendors and to some people I respect who work in security research and agree with some of the choices. And I think it's less, in my opinion, it's less of a breakthrough in model capability and more of a breakthrough in the amount of automation that we can do at any one point in time. And I think when we think about the amount of open source software that has been built over decades, which is huge, and then has skyrocketed because anybody can build software now, right? And then we think of the amount of time and money and energy we've put into securing our software, which always was much less than the amount of time and energy we put into building our software. And then we automate the ability to find bugs in software, which is what code-specific LLMs may be able to do. We now have essentially cheapened the cost of attacking a system. And in security, we always use this idea of how expensive would it be for somebody to break this? Well, now it has become really cheap to break stuff. And I think that was maybe some of the main concerns for public use of models, but now everybody's like, it's fine. So,
yeah.
But I think what we have to do is now maybe we have to actually invest in security, which security leaders have been arguing for a long time.
Yeah.
And they haven't been taken very seriously. And now I guess more companies will need to invest in security. Yeah.
Well, and this if this is not a useful, so then, looking at the sort of Anthropic, giving the government access to Mythos, or saying it's not going to release it, although it has released it to some degree, my understanding, with some companies or something like that. But, that's one strategy for dealing with the risk, I think, is limiting access to the dangerous model. But then is that different from, is investing more in security, is that an alternative so that you don't have to kind of centralize access to something? Or, are these kind of potentially techniques in tandem that people are going to be, interested in to resolve and prevent the cybersecurity concerns?
A few things to that. So let me try to make sure I organize my thoughts so that nobody mishears me. I think what I meant by that, to just be very much more specific, is in organizations, the security engineering, and where I come from, the privacy engineering, has often been the smallest engineering teams at an organization. And yet you have, hundreds of other teams pushing code, doing stuff. There was never enough time to review everything that was happening, right? And so the amount of insecure code that was already running around before LLMs was higher than most anybody probably would have guessed, unless you work in security and privacy engineering. And now we have LLMs that are optimized, that are fine-tuned for doing things like finding insecure code. I think that was on purpose, part of the training data and design of what was happening, because of course it's a very useful thing. But there's always been ways to find insecure code. The problem is you have to fix it. And that was always the argument, is the privacy and security teams create costs. They do not make money, they create costs. And they double create costs, because when they find a problem, then another team has to stop what they're doing and fix the problem.
Yeah.
And I think potentially some of the biggest problems that we need to have now, as humans together, debates that we need to have, is say, are we going to take this seriously now? Are we going to take privacy and security just as seriously as our product release? And I think different companies will treat it differently, and that's fine. But that's also why I tell people, maybe now is also time for you to think about, where do you put your data? Where do you spend your tokens? And these types of things, because at the end of the day, the coming years will be a difficult transition in technology, if only for the fact of security engineering and privacy engineering, if only for the fact of deciding, okay, now on top of the LLM generated code and all the other code we already had, we have to, treat security as a first order design principle, or privacy as a first order design principle. And perhaps that also changes the way people build things, right? There's lots of ways that we could change architectures so things are less centralized. There's lots of ways that we could offer things that require less data. There's many business models here to be explored that I think maybe will start to shift now that maybe centralizing everything in one place at one cloud provider is maybe not the future of hopefully the way data has to function.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think I think it's really important because I do feel like there is this way in which the appeal of the of AI as or the LLMs, and especially LLMs with a chat interface work, is that there is this promise that anyone can do anything in some ways, and you don't need to know. It's it taking advantage of the ability to do things without the knowledge, and yet there is this. I think people should be suspicious of that to some degree, in the sense that, like, sure. And, like, again, from a, like, just, there are people who just dismiss that there's something innovative and powerful about these technological developments. Of Obviously, these are powerful developments. But if you don't know about how things work, and if you just allow yourself to kind of passively go with the flow, then you can sort of unquestioningly accept things like, oh, well, obviously centralizing is the way to go, or obviously the biggest models with the most data are the ways to go. And then you lose out. And again, just from a pure, like, obviously I have maybe political and philosophical concerns with that kind of approach. But it's also just, again, if you want to actually take advantage of the technology, like, you're leaving efficiencies on the table. You're leaving opportunities on the table if you don't diversify and see the different possibilities that you might have now with these changes. And so, obviously, if you have thoughts on that, you can go. But that's kind of, I wanted to then transition to the kind of work that you've been doing with the feminist land parties, and the idea of, and also your public communications, the videos you release, and that kind of information of, like, why should the ordinary person not just be content with kind of, like, just kind of, using the chatbot in the kind of consumer vein, versus, like, what are some ways in which we can experiment and kind of understand and explore these things? Why is that useful? Again, not just to kind of demystify, but also to, like, think of possibilities, like new opportunities, new way of thinking about things, and kind of also empower us when it comes to the political conversations too.
If somebody wants to just, Netflix binge the LLM, that's total, I am not here
No
to judge
judgment.
you.
Yeah,
I am
no
not here to
judgment.
judge you. And if somebody never wants to touch an AI in their life, I am also there for you. Like,
No
I
judgment.
believe in your
Judgment free zone.
choices. Yeah, you have your own sovereignty, right?
Yeah.
And that's why I also said, like, data and AI, right?
Yeah,
Because you
data
also have
and AI.
other data, like you have your email provider, probably most people have, or where you have your website, or do you use social media? All these other choices you make. Do you have a phone or not? Anyways, there's lots of choices we make about our data these days. If you have the ability to choose, I think you should choose with a bit of empowerment and information, because not everybody has the right always to choose how data is collected about them. We see this more and more with worker surveillance and so forth,
Yes.
as where
Yeah. And
people
talking
have
about
no
AI.
choice, right? Yeah, exactly. And so if you can choose, please, whatever it is you want to do. And talk with others about their choices and say why you chose one way and not another way, right? I think we have to, have those conversations communally as well, because I think there is also a bit of despair that happens. I see that a lot in my work in privacy. When I work with people in different regions of the world, where they say, oh, but we don't have GDPR, it's not the same for us. I wish we had such things, right? But that's why it's important to collectively talk about such things and to try to find ways to empower persons, even when the choices are limited or non-existent. Right. So that's one piece. Sorry. And
Yeah.
then
No,
the
great.
other thing, how do we tinker? How do we play? How do we learn? Well, I think play is an important part of learning. Lots of other people agree who are much smarter than me about learning. So I think, inserting something like play into how you experience something new, whether it be an LLM or whatever a new model people are going to come out with. Or it's really fun also to play with stable diffusion models, so image models, especially with varied age groups, like as a family or something like this, because these are ways to kind of find some source of fun and inspiration, but to also start to politically question and socially question how models are designed, both in the data choices, in the political point of view choices, and other choices. And so this is why we started the Feminist AI Land Party, was at after a Women in Data and AI, actually more than just women, it's Flinte for any German speakers. So women, queer persons, lesbian and trans persons data conference that happens in Berlin. And on the following weekend, we basically hosted at a place that has a bunch of GPUs, the first Feminist AI Land Party. And the question was, what would a feminist AI be? And we ended up breaking up into two groups. Ines Montero, who is CEO of a group called Explosion AI, led one group, and they tried to figure out, could we label data for feminism? Like, could we get an LLM to produce things and then we would label it like, well, that was feminist, that was non-feminist, that was, racist, that was these things, right? And they kept having to expand the labels because they're like, oh, no, that's actually this thing and not this thing, right? So they were having this great conversation around if we were to label things, what would it even be like? And then the group I led said, ask, can we hack LLMs for feminism? So we were trying to figure out, could we poison the model so that it would become a feminist?
Yeah.
And we actually got some attacks working, where we got it working locally. And this is where I say, a small model can do. We got a small attack working, and then we tried it on ChatGPT, and it did work also on ChatGPT at that time, right, 2 years ago. I'm sure it's blocked by now, but these are ways where you can kind of demystify. I think create a social experience around whatever topic, right? So if you don't want to throw a feminist AI land party, you can throw whatever type of land party. But the idea is that we try it on local models first, and then we try it on the large models, the intransparent proprietary models, and then we can compare the two, right? And I think this can help people start to think about, what do these models mean for them and their work and their life, right?
Yeah. No, I love that. I think that's so cool. I find it very, like I said, I feels very, empowering to see this as like an opportunity for social kind of connection, and also for and that idea of learning through play being so essential. And I guess it feels like I feel sometimes that the despair that people feel is because of, I don't know, I guess I already said this, but just going back to, I just really find it pernicious when people emphasize maybe too much the kind of benefits of not of being able to do so much without understanding what you're actually doing. Like the idea, like I can understand, like, for example, I think some of the major, when people do talk about like the economic impact of the models, right? My understanding is a lot of the jobs that, companies might even say that they're cutting because of AI is also just because they're investing in the capital expenditures to kind of build out, so especially these tech companies to build out their tech more. But then there's also this idea of like, oh, like people won't need to know how to code anymore. Like the jobs that are being replaced are coding jobs. But it seems like there's almost this way in which, like, I guess I kind of feel like an ordinary person like me who didn't have to know much about coding because I could just rely on like, particular, products to do certain things. And I don't have to know how like, Word works to use it as a word processor. Now it's starting to feel like, oh, if I'm going to use these chatbots, actually, I kind of feel like I want to know more about like how this actually works. And like, maybe I'm never going to code something, but I want to kind of know on the back end what's happening here. And then like, so what you're doing here is like kind of empowering the ability of like, no, you like don't have to just, you don't have to just kind of passively consume this. You can actually question and think about this more deeply, and it's a source of like socializing too.
Yeah, and I think it kind of creates the questions and conversations that wouldn't exist if we didn't put a group of people together with that goal of exploring something together. So at this year's Feminist AI party, like one of the themes we had is like, if there was a femisphere, like which would be the feminist response to the manosphere, like what would it look like and what would it do? And I think, like, again, regardless of what types of communities you want to form around AI, I think it's about getting a group of humans together because collectively we always, are more intelligent, right? And have non-artificial intelligence. And I think having that also shift the emotions in the room a bit, or at least give a space where they can be expressed amongst each other, maybe also create some shifts in the power dynamics that allow companies to say things like, we're going to fire 40% of people and replace them with AI, right? Because if we don't have a collective response to such things, then it becomes a one sided conversation.
Yeah, yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, and that's what I was thinking about. I mean, you can't kind of separate out the question of the development of AI from various kind of political or concerns around freedom and autonomy of people like workers, but also you brought up earlier too the whole issue around models that are based on data that might be copyrighted and the kind of impact of the development of models on kind of knowledge production from human beings. So I was wondering. I mean, I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak more on that and how you think of that as a machine learning scientist, in terms of the kind of concerns that people have around that. And is there a way to kind of take advantage of these technologies without being complicit in that type of kind of extraction of knowledge, and violation of copyright, but also kind of the ability for people to be more have more ownership over the information that they're generating, the knowledge they're generating.
I'm going to make a slight detour, if that's okay. I think, like, one of the things maybe this is showing knowledge workers, because we were, like, myself included, right? I'm a data scientist, machine learning engineer. Now an LLM can do that. Like, what is the point of my knowledge, right? Is some of the experience that we're now going through is some of the experience of many workers around the world went through with many different shifts, really political shifts. I wouldn't even say it's automation, but political choices due to trade agreements, shifts of labor, other things like this. Like, my grandfather was a steel worker in Pennsylvania. He was the child of a Polish immigrant who was a coal miner in Pennsylvania. There's been many eras of workers.
Yeah, yeah.
And now knowledge workers, where we thought, like, we have I speak for myself and people like me, we thought we had like we got an advanced degree, we get to sit here and relax. Now it's maybe being shown that maybe the, systems at play will also not have an always a privileged experience to some degree for that type of work. I do, however, collective resistance and collective organizing, and also being mindful of how you use things are all ways that groups of workers, no matter where they come from, have helped shape work systems, right? And how they interact with other systems. And I guess the question starts to become is obviously there's power imbalances, and that comes into play, right? And some of the problems that are happening now is that, if you're like, I went back to, and I'll find the name of the company, but it used to be a company that used to operate, and they found people with advanced degrees who had just finished their work study, and they placed them in research labs. And that was their whole business model. And then a year or two ago, they started just hiring them out as freelance contractors for writing stuff for AI. And I think what we have to question is, A, is that a thing that we want? Will that benefit society in the long run? And B, If not, then we have to create job opportunities for humans to continue being human experts with a reasonable expectation of having a good career and life ahead of them. And if we can't give people that, then I guess we have to ask some bigger questions about what's happening. And so, sorry, I went on a very
that's
different
no. That's no,
path.
that's actually that's the same kind of what that's just I wanted to get back to that question of like honestly, this just underscores what I think was the theme throughout the conversation, which is that technology is inherently political, or technological change is inherently wrapped up in political economic institutions as well, and both institutions that shape choices and actual choices that we can make. And it's hard, I think, like the ability for us to, work together is also shaped by policy. I mean, it's shaped by whether policy makes it easier or harder for people to collaborate and to organize together. And I think, it is an example of like, I think it's both also within, private sphere, within like companies, there's a lot of kind of issues of power and difficulties. And so, that is like one thing that you're describing is both like the development of, companies that then have these jobs for people who have advanced degrees, then kind of just using them to train AI as kind of one kind of part of that power question. But then there's also the power question of like people who are at companies. So I just because this is what's top of mind, because this was just in the news and Wired had a couple pieces on this with Meta's, AI. I don't know if this was something you were following, the AI. Now it's like an AI lab of sorts where they were tracking, workers, everything they were doing on the computer, collecting all this data and in order to train their AI. And then, obviously people were already upset about it in the company because of privacy concerns. And then there ended up being, I guess, some sort of security issue or privacy issue with the data. I mean, it was all internal, but it was still like validated the exact kind of concerns that workers had. But it just showed, we have such a we have our society, and I think it's fair to say like workers, especially workers who are actually employed by Meta and rather than just contract workers and are in these types of roles as opposed to kind of like content moderation roles that happen in all sorts of primarily even in the global South. There's sort of these power differentials, right? But even these like very, very privileged workers not having kind of voice over policies being made in their company creates it really underscores how even if you think you have like a socially privileged position in your community, you might still have kind of vulnerabilities, and tech is kind of bringing that to the fore, both tech and the kind of economics of tech too. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that specifically, but I mean that what you brought up kind of is of course I think very relevant to what's happening right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I started to get interested in privacy work, I also became quite interested in the work of Joseph Weizenbaum, who I am sure that you're familiar with. But Joseph Weizenbaum, I mean, a lot of people like to say, well, he's just such a pessimist. I would say I'm like an optimistic person who's still also very much likes Joseph Weizenbaum. I think he's worth listening to. But he also invented technically the first chatbot. It was the ELIZA system, which I'm sure many people have now heard of because it's in the news. But Weizenbaum also he wrote quite a bit of work. He also worked on the first automated check reader system for the Bank of America. And so he was working at MIT, and then he got contracted by the Bank of America to build the first system that read checks in and could say, oh, yeah, I think this is this number, that number, whatever, whatever. And shortly after he did that, he said a quote, I won't quote it exactly, but I'll try to find it, where it's basically like that he thought that computers were inherently a conservative force.
Yeah.
Because they allow for consolidation of information. And if information is power, then this is a thing. And if information is power and computers can consolidate information quickly and automate this, then maybe computers also can help consolidate power. And I don't think he's wrong. I also maybe think that computers can do lots of other things too, but I agree with his sentiment. And I think we can all, anybody that has seen the shifts in however long they've used computers, can also see the shift in, what a computer can do, what you can automate, what, if you've ever been in a country that has limited internet access versus non-limited internet access, these are all things that can be used. And if you're the person that can pull the lever, then you have a lot of, or if you're the person who can tell the person to pull the lever, then that really changes things. And I think machine learning is just another version of that type of thing.
Well, I think that's great because I also think it's a sort of a corrective of, at least for me growing up and, seeing the 90s and like the early 2000s. And I think, various companies like Meta, but also Apple in the 80s, this before I was aware. But there was always often this like discussion of like the internet and like computers, especially the personal computer, being like a democratizing, decentralizing force. Right. And I think I think for a lot of people who maybe got used to that, this is like now shocking to have to think about like things like surveillance, have to think about things like the way that power is consolidated through technology, right? And through access to the technology. And so it's like a really important corrective because I think for a lot of people, like to think of like a computer as like consolidating power is maybe not what's natural, and yet it's there, right? Like and I think part of what that but what I like that also for you to bring that up is that it's a good kind of showing the kind of complexity of technology and digital technology that also complements the fact that you do the feminist land parties and like the idea of like and of attacking and like that is also like it very much reminiscent to me of like Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, which I've talked about with a previous guest before, and this idea of like kind of trying to tease out the duality and the complexity and like seeing like where are the gaps, like where is it that democratic or decentralizing or like potential is, and that is fundamentally not just like a technical capacity, it's a political act, like it's a thing that we have to push on and work towards rather than just something that is inherent to any given technology.
Yeah, and I think that we have to imagine because I think like I was discussing with some peers the other day and I was saying, well, now search is broken, search doesn't work anymore. We could redo search.
Yeah.
Like
There's
we
a
could.
market opportunity.
Well, I don't even mean
No, I
market. It's
know.
like,
No, I
I
know.
mean, thinking back to the same thing you're thinking about, where like, I remember my first website was in a web ring.
Yeah.
Look it up, ask your favorite chatbot about what a web ring is if you don't know what it is. But like, there's ways, inherently, the internet also has this tug. It's decentralized by protocol design. It's sadly become very centralized by the actual tubes that are running in the ground. But to rethink what does it mean? And this is why I spend a lot of time, as I know you referenced, but I spend a lot of time trying to talk with people about how do you run your own stuff? How do you self host? Pointing people to finding ways for them to, you know, even if they only do it for a month, because then they decide, I don't like doing this, I want to do something else, to start to think about what would something that isn't fully centralized, that isn't in the hand of large ticker name here, um, what might that look like? And I think there's lots of maybe options for people to start exploring that because I think now it's becoming trendy, which is cool.
Yeah.
Let's
Yeah.
make
Yeah.
it let's
Yeah,
make
let's
it
make it
very cool.
trendy. Yeah, let's get a new trend going. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
and I think there's an opportunity for that. I think people get, trends do come and go and people want, new ways of thinking about things. Yeah, can I ask just briefly because I don't want to take up, too much of your time, but I think it can sound really intimidating, the idea of self-hosting. I have a friend who does self-host. He has a whole thing in it, but it seems like very complicated and he has like a lot of hardware for it, but it seems like there's probably a lot of different degrees to it. You did mention before there are some smaller models you can run on your computer and even older computers with open, like the Mozilla model, things like that. So could you just, maybe also demystify that, make it seem like it's, not make it, but is it something that's within the hands of somebody who's not very technical, doesn't want to invest a lot in new hardware, things like that? Is it still something we could explore?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the experience is going to vary a lot depending on what hardware you have and how much time you care about such things. But self-host, like installing something like Olama and then like running a few queries, like with it's just a LLM, that runs on your device, or using a llama file from the Mozilla AI project is something I think most everybody. The llama file is a little bit more complicated, but Olama I think everybody can do. And then getting curious about different AI companies. I mean, there's so many different AI vendors now. You could try to find one in your region that's small, and you could look at that. Or you could, I know people that do self hosting now of other stuff. So, like, I use a project that's called Image, Immich, to host my photos. And it has all of the perks that any other photo hosting service does, but it just runs on a little computer in my house. And I have people that are like, that's way too much work. I don't want to learn how to use all these things. But they're like, oh, I can have insert AI vendor name here. I can have that set it up for me. So you could even say, hey, Claude, OpenAI, Gemma, Meta, you could say any of these companies, can you get my image server running for me? And if that's, the entryway into getting your photos of you and your family and loved ones and friends out of big name social media and onto something that you can share with people that's hosted on your home computers, then that is also, like, I think that's also a win. That would be a force of consolidation that at least you're consolidating in the right direction.
Yeah. No, that's great. No, but that's also like I love that because it's not like it's not a purist approach to things. I mean, it's showing also that like you can use a mix of these different tools for things that still move you in a direction to feeling like you have more control over your data, over your kind of technical life, right? And I think that's really important. So that's super helpful. I'm like, no, I'm also noting these for myself.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think it's, I I mean, there's a Reddit sub community that has so many examples called self-hosted. I mean, there's a bunch of people that specialize in teaching people these things. I, of course, have some videos for people that want to get started hosting their own AI stuff with privacy and security. But I think, you know, what I don't want people to feel is obligated and guilty if they don't want to do it, because at the end of the day, I like to talk about the fact that we shouldn't be, we should hold the people responsible who are actually responsible for ensuring data protection and security. And it's not anybody's fault that all their friends are on this chat versus that chat versus this social media versus that. That's not, nobody should individualize that type of like guilt or shame or something around technology choice. But I do think it is kind of cool that we are starting to shift maybe towards a feeling where maybe that becomes more accessible, because we have to make it more accessible if people are going to use it, and B, where maybe people feel a little bit more empowered to try it out. And you don't have to, but if you want to, it's there.
Yeah, well, and I have to admit, I mean, I did also grow up, well, actually, I didn't grow up with this because I only watched it for the first time recently, the movie Hackers from the
Oh, yeah.
90s. And I just had a feeling, yeah, it's so good. I was thinking like, wow, like what if I had like watched this, like if I had watched it, if I had been a little bit older and like could have watched it as like a teenager when it came out, like what would that have like done to like my whole life? Like I feel like, yeah, I could be you. Which is so cool. Like but you have like Hackers and you have Matrix, you have like other, I mean, I think Johnny Mnemonic is like a little less, but you have all these like 90s cyber movies that are in this moment where people are, and like this is partly because it's like before like social media and like major changes, like and kind of also rise of like walled garden type of aspects of the internet. The internet was so much more wild, right? And so you have this like image, like for people like me, you have this like it feels like a moment in culture and in like internet history where people were empowered, like people were, and they were doing things together and they were independent, and there was this like possibility in the internet. And I do kind of feel like, I guess when I get upset and frustrated about tech right now, it's when it feels like there's only ever more consolidation. Like, again, this sort of like mystification of things and making it seem like, oh, you don't have to worry about this. Like, don't worry about it. Like, we and the government, we're going to sort this out for you. Um, that's when I get upset.
That's never gone wrong in history.
Yeah. That's when I start getting upset and I start getting like despairing. But then when I talk to people like you and I'm watching your videos and listening to your keynotes and stuff, I feel very like, oh no, we're moving, like we might be back in the 90s in the sense of this possibility, in this like we have to do that actively ourselves. Like it's not just natural to what's happening, but it's like if we kind of try to orient us away and think about this experimentation and play and possibility, like maybe there's a way to push back on that consolidation, and also just be a little bit more open. And that's like why for me, like as an academic, a lot of the discussions with LLMs and AI are about like, are we going to use it in your writing? Like, and, you know, are people using it in their books? And presses, you know, debates around like journals and presses saying like, you're not allowed to use AI, and then people wanting to push back. Like, so as I've said before, I don't really use it, especially not in my writing, partly because of the norms being figured out, but also because I just don't enjoy it. So I don't do that. But then when, you know, but this example of like, you can be somebody who maybe doesn't use it in your writing, but you can still explore with it and understand it and like, and engage with it as a phenomenon of its own. Right. And like, that's valuable and like, that's compelling. And I think that is useful, even if you're somebody who might be, you know, against it in various other tasks and purposes, or worried about its economic impact and stuff like that. It might be worth exploring in the way that you're describing, because it also helps us like rethink like possibilities of the future and like and the political potential too.
Well, and the fact that now LLMs can write code. And one of the things that I find really joyful is people building a small little thing for themselves
Yeah.
just because they really found it cool, you know? And I also don't like using AI for writing or even for editing. I find it makes me sound weird. Like
Yes,
it's
I
always
don't
like
know.
you write too unprofessionally. I'm like, stop calling me. I am very professional.
Yeah, yeah,
I don't need to hear from you.
yeah.
Anyways, but I use it, for example, to cluster different types of writing and reading that I have, and to like do other things that I know it can do, but that I don't, that don't annoy me.
Yeah.
So
Well,
I just,
what's an
yeah, sorry.
example of that, just so that because I'm learning.
Oh yeah, so I have like one workflow where I take all of the research that I want to read, which I of course unfortunately have more than I will probably
I
ever read in my lifetime,
Same.
and
I mean,
continue
all
adding.
of
It's
us.
fine.
Yeah, of course.
Is and I have it, try to create tags for what topics. And then when I'm like, oh yeah, I want to look at stuff like this, I have it search through and then recommended. Then I can be like, you're wrong on this, right? Reclassify or build me a machine learning model that can classify better or whatever it is that I want to do. But then I kind of both have, the memory system, if we're going to use, today's AI systems, built on top and stored. Literally, I have it store summaries of all of the papers, and then I can search through them using both normal search, which, normal summary search, and then I can also use it using LLM assisted search. And that's something I do to prioritize some of my reading, and that is an okay thing. I like that part. Not everybody will like that. That's fine, but that's one of the
Well,
ways
it's
I
like a
use.
navigating of like a personal library that
Yeah.
is helpful. Yeah. I totally get that. That makes sense to me. Cool. That's it. That I feel like that's like, you know, even someone who's like the most skeptic. I mean, you're right. Some people might not like that either, but it does have like a real kind of measured, and I think also realistic to like what the capacities of these might be and how they might be able to enable productivity of your own creativity on for yourself without being really that different from what we're used to in terms of, using libraries, using search, things like that.
Yeah. And so whenever I tell people get started local AI, like choose something like some specific thing that you find annoying. And, maybe there's parts of it that you can speed up, right? Not fully automate, right? Because even I have multiple steps. I have one library that's really good at taking PDFs and turning it into Markdown because LLMs love Markdown. And then I have one that summarizes from the Markdown to a much smaller Markdown. And so then I use a project called QMD, which is Query Markdown, that literally just uses normal search algorithms if I'm not feeling like talking to the documents. And then I have another one that if I want to ask it to prioritize the documents, then I can talk to an LLM. And then at the end of the day, I just open the document and I go for my reading journey. So, and yes, of course, LLMs hallucinate and all of those things are true. So asterisk, asterisk, summaries might be wrong, can be wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
So just, if you can take that amount of error in your working process, then there you go.
That's awesome. That's great. Well, that's also a good kind of way to, I think, start wrapping up and a way out of the kind of maybe frustration or fear and into like more sizable ways that if somebody's interested, how they can like explore these things. And again, even in the very sense of just experimenting and understanding better how these things work. That's really great. Are there any things that we didn't get to talk about today that you were hoping to discuss? I feel like we covered a lot, but I'm always happy to talk to you more. So
I guess like more than anything, I want people to feel maybe that there is some agency even in times of despair. And so I hope, maybe there's been moments, if you're still listening, that things have been hard, whatever emotions are coming up have been hard for the listeners or for you, whoever you are.
yeah.
And to just know that, I guess to some degree that a lot of the feelings that people are experiencing right now are extremely tough experiences. And just that if there's anything that we've learned from history, it's that humans overcome extreme challenging moments, but especially if they can find a way to work together. And so regardless of consolidation of power, boss says blah, AI company says they're gonna, well, who knows what do the next
Yeah.
whatever they're gonna do.
Yeah.
Just know, there's been many eras of these types of things, and I love that we always think we're the special era, but we are the
Yeah.
special era. Always, you're very special.
Yeah.
But that maybe one of the things to take away from this is just like something that you can do for you, for your family, with your friends, with your coworkers, that can bring just a little bit of the feeling of power and engagement back to you. So I hope maybe you'll do one small thing.
Yeah. No, I love that. I think that's really excellent. And I think that's a really important kind of lesson. I think the other thing is that, remembering that there are a lot of different people who are thinking about these issues like you. And it's not just, whatever they see on the news, whoever the loudest voices are. There's like a lot of different people and a lot of different approaches. And so to know that there are also people who are in this who share the concerns that some people might have. It's not, there are a lot of us who, have these concerns while also, trying to figure out like what are the opportunities, what are the possibilities, and how to make things better too. So that's really great. Thank you so much for this incredible conversation. I love talking with you, and I'm so excited to share this with our audience. Yeah, this has been really great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kristen.
In our conversation, Katharine cited Joseph Weizenbaum, who was a computer scientist and professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In a 1985 interview, Weizenbaum said that the computer has, from the beginning, been a fundamentally conservative force. So to give you a little bit of context to this, he had said this in response to this question. Do you think the computer is creating a technical elite, reinforcing old power structures, or remaking American society? For decades, the rise of the internet, the smartphone, and other devices that have enhanced access to digital technologies have often been treated as inherently decentralizing and democratizing. So it can be really striking to read this 1985 interview now, which we've linked to in the show notes. He went on to explain how the significant mid-20th century increase in population had been putting pressure on American banks. And the computer allowed banks to keep up with increases in checks that were being written. He even designed the first computer banking system in the U.S. for Bank of America. His point was that had the computer not been invented, then the banks would have had to socially innovate instead. And maybe the banks themselves would have had to institutionally decentralize or regionalize. This so perfectly captures one of the major motivations of this podcast. Living through the 24-hour news cycle in the middle of the major technological changes of the past decade or so, it can be easy to get wrapped up in the novelty of it all. Despite their severe disagreements, both celebrants and critics of new technologies do tend to converge on a kind of techno-determinism that oversimplifies the relationship between new tech and politics or society. How do already existing political economic structures and the efforts of actual people and organizations help shape both the directions that innovation goes into, as well as how we can incorporate these changes into our institutions and our lives? This conversation with Katharine gave me a lot of hope in terms of seeing the possibilities of new technologies by better centering how individuals and communities that we build together can play with them. We started distinguishing between legal and technical privacy with an emphasis on the latter. Technical privacy refers to the practices of privacy engineers using math, statistics, and system design to avoid patterns that may enable violations of laws dictating privacy or users' social and cultural senses of privacy. If a model is trained using differential privacy, then it shouldn't be possible to extract or leak any particular details traceable to a specific individual present in its training data. It should only be possible to share information about aggregate patterns. Katharine emphasized how crucial it is to distinguish between technical privacy and legal privacy, because a company may be able to conform with legal privacy. They say things like they informed people and they don't release data, but that doesn't scientifically mean that they haven't memorized their data and put the user at an undue privacy risk that makes their particular information vulnerable to attackers. We also talked about today's biggest large language models. While there's a lot we can't know about closed or proprietary models, Katharine explained how model designers shape user experience, changing what appears to be the personalities, quote unquote, of chatbots. If a chatbot, for example, comes across as sycophantic, which is quite common, that is also partly shaped by the adjustments that model designers can do to adjust its performance through both the system prompt, which is the foundational set of instructions given on the back end before a user types in a query. And the designers can also tweak the model's attention mechanism, algorithms by which a model processes text, what words it focuses on, ignores, or associates together. These can be tweaked and shape the user experience. But we also talked about open source and open weight models. As Katharine says, there's almost no really open source models. So for something to really fit the ideal of open source, it would have to mean that the builder has shared the training data, how the model was trained, validation and evaluation or testing data sets, and maybe even the code that went into the programming of the model and its architecture. All of these data points, all this information would help enable replication by others to kind of verify how it works, what its strengths and weaknesses are. And as Katharine says, this is in line with really long-held traditions, honestly, of open science. Look at open source coding, for example. I'll add that open science is really important for those of us in philosophy, politics, and economics. Joel Mokyr, the most recent winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, has a great 2005 article that highlights the economic benefits of the rise of practices of open science, as well as other factors that shaped modern economic growth. This is the article, The Intellectual Origins of Modern Economic Growth, which we'll link to in the show notes. When it comes to concerns like privacy and security, Katharine talked about how open weight models and other measures of transparency can be really helpful. The cryptography community has emphasized the advantages of broadening access so that people can find vulnerabilities more easily and fix them more easily. But this also means that the builder of a model, whether it's open weight or closed weight, really does need to invest in privacy and security teams that can help reduce the risk of these violations. There are other measures as well that could help reduce these risks. Katharine talked a lot about how a lot of the advancements of models are due to relying on massive amounts of data and increasing model size. With increasing model size and massive data, this can actually increase the risk of privacy violations as it exposes more people and information to leaks or attacks. These really large models can be really costly too financially, also in terms of memory. So smaller models that don't attempt to capture a giant amount of data might also be more useful. They might be more economically and ecologically efficient depending on the tasks at hand. They can also expose less people, less information to privacy failures and harms. The way that she put it was that using smaller task-specific models can be the difference between wanting access to the internet and saying that I want to store the entire internet on my phone itself. She really emphasized the idea of prioritizing privacy and security into the way that people build things in the first place. There are ways to change architectures so that things are less centralized, can offer products that require less data. Local models can also be modified by communities to suit their particular needs, like languages that may not be properly addressed and incorporated by the dominant models. Katharine also talked about the feminist AI LAN parties that she runs, where people can run local models and through hacking and playing with these models better understand how any model works. I love these practices because it points to the need for us to turn to community to better demystify these models, to learn together, and help understand their strengths, their weaknesses, and how they might be able to use them for the things that they actually want to do. I think that these social experiences also help counteract the sense of loneliness, a lack of agency that we experience in this very uncertain and disruptive moment. It seems like an antidote to me to the sense that there are all these changes around us being led by the bigger actors, bigger players that we aren't able to affect, and we can better understand how to get involved and how to judge the kind of messages that we're hearing. Again, from either the big supporters and celebrants of these technologies as well as the critics. If the feminist AI LAN parties aren't really your thing, Katharine really emphasized just the point of getting together with people about whatever topics you're interested in, getting firsthand experimental experiences. I think increasing access, knowledge, and communication among people throughout our communities with all sorts of different knowledge and experiences that will help kind of shape the perspectives that we can have about these changes will be necessary, especially the more that we talk about the politics of AI and the issues like data sovereignty and other trends that Katharine and I discussed in this episode. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.